Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Sojourning Writer. Today we're going to be actually taking a look at what we learned on Tuesday and try to create a story based off of those same ideas or same concepts. So this will help us stretch our ability to take the same core values or the core situations and try to apply it to other situations. This will allow us to not only have a better understanding of what happened, but also other ways that we can take these same tropes or ideas and apply them to our own stories. I firmly believe that it's not just the stories that we write, but rather how we are able to practice what we have or improv what we are looking to do so that we can have a more robust understanding of how to tell a story. Before we get into that, I actually want to discuss a topic that sometimes we here in current year tend to forget when it comes to situations like with what happened with Alahuapa and Pizarro. One of the issues that we can sometimes have issue with is the idea of chronological snobbery. Chronological snobbery is a situation, and it's defined by C.S. Lewis as the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate of our own age and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that count discredited. This is a C.S. Lewis, and he's generally talking more about the Christian perspective or the Christian idea of history. But what I wanted to get to the point for that is that C.S. Lewis' point here is that sometimes we in the West, particularly us who have grown up under the tutelage of Disney, other entertainment, when we're seeing stories being told and we're taking in those stories, and we don't take in those stories critically or try to understand what the lesson is or the deeper meaning of what's going on. If we take the very narrow understanding or the very narrow perspective of what history is being presented to us, we really can truly miss what's actually going on or the historical context. For instance, if we watched the movie Pocahontas, and as great as a movie as that is, that gives us a very specific perspective on the relations between the Native Americans and the English. Now, whether or not there was evils committed on the Native Americans has little to do with my point. My point is that we're only given a very narrow perspective on how relations between the Native Americans actually played out. Because at the end of it, it's not a documentary. We aren't necessarily looking to see who is right in the purpose of that story. We're actually looking at a different story altogether. But what can end up happening is that we adapt that very, very watered down version of Native Americans as what actually happened. Now, one of the issues with that is that particularly in South and Central Americas, those Native American populations were really violent. And I'm not talking about taking over or conquering different tribes, but rather the fact that human sacrifice was either a core or a not uncommon element to their religious rituals. For instance, the Aztecs were particularly violent when it came to how they are sacrificing to their gods, to the point where the Spanish conquistadors were discussing that they had piles and piles and piles of skulls, human skulls of people who had been sacrificed. It wasn't uncommon for stories to be that there were rivers of blood pouring down the temples of people who were being sacrificed. We're talking thousands and thousands of people who were sacrificed for the gods. Now, you could easily say, well, the Incans don't necessarily have that, but while that's true, the Incans had their own version of religious human sacrifice. From what I've read, and I will link this in the description below, it was not uncommon for when there was a new monarch in to take over the Incan Empire that 200 children were set ablaze as a sacrifice. That if things went wrong, if there were great trials or tribulations in that country, human sacrifice was what they went to reverse those tragedies. So I just want to make that a point that when we tell a story, that while we are showing a very specific side of whatever story we're looking at, that we take into account when we see this, that there are really no people who are innocent in the way that we in the West, particularly we who have grown up under seeing the Disney and having a very narrow perspective on human interactions. We have a very watered down version of that, that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to how those things actually play out. Now, for instance, in our story, if we are taking the sides of the conquistadors, the people who are invading the Native American population, it is very easy to make sure that we are showing the horrors that the Native Americans were doing on each other. Now, when we talk about human sacrifice, that is something that was pretty much done away with Christianity. Christianity came in and washed away all sense of the vast majority of human sacrifices, rituals that involved human sacrifices. One of the last ones was the Carthaginians. So the idea that human sacrifice that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to is that when the Christians came in and they saw the horrendous abuses that were being taken place, anybody who would be in their situation having a perspective of a Christian would see that human sacrifice as something abhorrent and be willing to do whatever it takes to stop that human sacrifice. Now, to stop that human sacrifice means that you're going to have people who want it to continue. And when you have two parties that are unwilling to compromise as something over as huge as human sacrifice, and there is no compromise for those that want to destroy human sacrifice, there's no compromise for those that want to keep human sacrifice. There's nothing you can compromise when it comes to that particular religious ritual. But what ends up happening is you're going to have people saying, no, you're not going to do this anymore. And their only response is fighting the people that are dictating the end of this. Humans have been using human sacrifice for any number of reasons. I just wanted to touch on that going through because I want to make sure that we're not necessarily looking to see or create a story where we're saying this person's bad or this group of people bad, but rather how do we take the elements of the story and actually show both sides of why it was either A, bad for the invaders to come in and destroy the culture, or B, why it was a good thing for the invaders to come in. I just want to make sure that we uncouple our own moral philosophies and unattach our own perspective so that we can write a more complex story. Because what can we end up happening is that when we try to create a story, when we want to tell a specific story, we want to make sure that the people that we care about are always on the good. The problem is that when that's the case, what ends up happening is that we create stories that literally have very little impact. So let's get into it. We'll take a look at some of the slides that I talked about on Tuesday so we can actually see what can we do to add to or implement into our own story. And to make it a little interesting, we're going to be trying to be as current time as possible so that we can see where the issues are, what things are working, what things aren't working, and what has to change in order to make sure the story fits. Atahualpa was an absolute monarch of the largest and most advanced state in the New World, while Pizarro represented the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, also known as Charles I of Spain, monarch of the most powerful state in Europe. So if we actually take a look at absolute monarchs are actually one of the rarest forms of control of rulership that we have in human history. It's easy to say, oh, a king is an absolute monarch, but 9 times out of 10, that was never the case. Because when a king has a system set up, he is generally working with other people. They are not following lockstep with what they want. Typically, you only see that in religious systems. An absolute monarch requires something beyond the physical to control. Absolute monarch is something that they need to have some sort of religious or quasi-religious aspect to. A idea that you can use this in, or a example of this would be North Korea. North Korea has Kim Jong-un, who is a absolute monarch of a type. Now, of course, they try to play it under or try to add things to it, but absolute monarch and a dictator are essentially the same thing. True dictators are actually kind of rare. If you ever watch the movie Death of Stalin, when Stalin dies, there was absolute chaos that took place after his death. And that's what we're looking at, that same type of mindset where Atahualpa was creating his absence, created a chaotic state that Pizarro was able to take advantage of. Atahualpa was revealed by the Incas as a sun god and exercised absolute authority over his subjects who obeyed the orders he issued from captivity. This is what I was talking about earlier. Absolute monarch requires a very narrow hierarchy. The broader the hierarchy, the more likely that the person at the top is going to have less control. And you see this very specifically with dictators. True dictators require that the little amount of authority is given to those around him. It rests squarely on that person. Why did Pizarro capture Atahualpa? Pizarro's military advantage lay in the Spaniards' steel swords, other weapons, steel armor, guns, horses. To those weapons, Atahualpa's troops, without animals on which to ride in a battle, could only oppose stone, bronze, and then it goes on to mention other weapons. So, not only do we have to have a situation where the invading element has a much better understanding of combat or combat technology, but we also have to have them faced against a very narrow hierarchy that puts so much more power at the top rather than spreading it out like a pyramid. As I had mentioned on Tuesday, a strict hierarchy is going to like what you would see with the Jenga tower, where any element that gets pulled out tends to mean collapse, particularly at the top. And if we see that as at the bottom, if we reverse it, because everything's relying on the dictators or the absolute monarch's authority, everything has to be derived from that. Whereas a broader hierarchical structure, like what we see in the West, particularly in the United States, we aren't requiring other people's permission to do our job. The person making burgers isn't waiting for authority to come to him from the President of the United States. That's what we're talking about, a broad understanding or a broad concept of hierarchy. The more narrow it is, the more likely it is the people at the top are able to seize control and maintain control. The tremendous advantage that the Spaniards gained from their horses left out of eyewitness accounts. Horsemen could easily outrun Indian sentries before the sentries had time to warn Indian troops behind them, and could ride down and kill Indians on foot. The idea here is that intelligence is an aspect that we have to take into account. How is our invading element controlling information that's getting out? Are they able to prevent communications? Are they shutting down world communications? Or are they talking in a very specific area? So in our hypothetical story here, you need certain elements like that hierarchy that I mentioned. We need a lack of communication with other elements on or other cultures within the world that's being invaded. And we need to have them technologically advanced. Atahualpa's capture was decisive for the European conquest of the Inca Empire, although the Spanish superior weapons could have assured an ultimate Spanish victory. In any case, the capture made the conquest quicker and infinitely easier. So my point here is that, yes, and I mentioned this on Tuesday, the cost of conquering is going to change depending on the different elements we have in our story. So if you have a broken down system, a broader hierarchy that is not susceptible to taking out the leadership, that striking at the head of the snake, as they say. If you have a much broader system, so for instance, if an invading force came to America and blew up the White House or captured everybody in the White House and then disappeared, yes, there would be elements of chaos. Yes, there would be elements of confusion and whatnot, but the vast majority of people would be able, not to say that they would, but would be able to continue their life as if nothing changed. And that's what a broader hierarchy system looks like. Why did Atahualpa walk into the trap? In hindsight, we find it astonishing that Atahualpa marched into Pizarro's obvious trap. The Spaniards who captured him were equally surprised at their success. So one of the issues that we have that an invading force would have issue with in our own system is the fact that because we have such a proliferation of information or stories that we have told ourselves over the course of decades, stories that have come out of Hollywood, we are automatically more suspicious of what's going to happen when we interact with a more technologically advanced society. Now, if we go back to the North Koreans, because they haven't had the exposure, that cultural exposure, they are going to be a lot more open to whatever the more technologically advanced system is going to be pressing upon them. So, for instance, if you had a technologically advanced person take the cabinet of Kim Jong-un, that top section of the government, 9 times out of 10, because any dictator requires that their authority be absolute, means that anybody who is capable of threatening their control is ultimately gotten rid of. This means that North Korea would be extremely susceptible to this type of manipulation, that if aliens came down and captured the top portion of the North Korean government and then dictated to the North Korean people what they wanted to do, that would be similar to what happened here with the Incas, that because what they would be able to do is set up a base of operations that they could port in resources and troops and be able to send out scouting parties, that would be similar to what ended up happening. So for instance, if you, and then this is just a spitball idea of how this could play out real world. You have a alien invasion, but they go to North Korea and they take control of the North Korean communication network as well as Kim Jong-un. And because they are able to get Kim Jong-un to get his people to follow after him, they are able to set up a base of operations from which they are able to conquer the world. This is something that is easy to see how it would play out. Now, this means that if you're going to have this happen in another situation, you need to set up the scene as the same way or in similar ways that makes that where the logical leaps are not too extreme, that things are going to play out in this particular way. So say, for instance, you are on the side of an invasion force. What does that society looks like? What are the evils that society is doing? So let's take the world as we understand it today, but let's say that mid-century Germans took over the world and they were doing horrendous things. Most people would say, hey, that's a reason for a reasonable expectation to go in and invade that type of society. So what are we doing? How are we setting up specific points so that we are able to have our characters get into this world so that they can take it over with reasonable expectations? Now, one of the things that we also need to take into account is the limitations of the technology. For the Spaniards, it was pretty easy to understand what the limitations of their technology was. Steel weapons, melee weapons, basic ranged weapons, as in guns, firearms. These are not the firearms that we have today, but rather cannons that they were carrying around with them. They were a little bit more than cannons. So, keeping that in mind and how we're actually going to tell the story, when we have our technology have an impact, it cannot be in such a way that it can wipe out all communications across the world or create the easy path for us. We don't want that, because what happens is that when we use our technology, and it's the same thing with the magic system, when there's too easy or there's no cost to the goal of what we're trying to do, we reduce the tension of what we want them to have. We want to make sure that our reader is feeling that emotional catharsis at the end. And the only way to have that emotional catharsis is there to be a level of tension throughout the story. That level of tension requires that things are at risk. And if things are too easy, if you have a magic system that is broken, or it makes overcoming the difficulties too easy. And I'm using magic and technology interchangeable because they essentially play that same way, or they play that same thing in the story for our purposes. We need to make sure that we're telling our story in a way that allows for risk to be a critical factor or a ongoing factor in our story, or else they're just going to get bored. Our readers are going to get bored because there's no tension. So that's pretty much all I had for today. I wanted to thank anybody who watched this. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave a comment below. As always, I will be putting all the information I use in the description below. So until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.